Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to this special webinar organized by the Peace and Security Division of the Nkafu Policy Institute. Today, we are going to be discussing on the theme, the effectiveness of African solutions to African problems in silencing the guns in Africa. And we're very proud that in this webinar, we have knowledgeable panelists, experts who will be talking very much in-depthly about this topic. Moderating today's session is none other than Mr. Francis Tazaocha, who is the Director of the Peace and Security Division of the Nkafu Policy Institute. He has a master's degree in Natural Resources and Peace from the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. His areas of expertise include peace building, conflict resolution, governance and democracy, particularly on matters around research, policy development, knowledge management, and post-conflict peace building and reconstruction. Mr. Francis, it's a pleasure to have you moderate today's session. And just as a quick reminder to everyone joining us, we are going to have a Q&A session immediately after the panel discussion. So please use the box below. You can see it at the bottom right. Use that to send in your questions, and also use the chat box to interact with our panelists and with our attendees. It's a pleasure to have you join us, Mr. Francis, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ansel. Good afternoon, dear panelists. Good afternoon, our dear listeners who have joined us in this web or this event. As Ansel really said, Africa have actually been a continent that has continuously faced complex challenges ranging from issues of governance, poor socio-economic development within its borders, to growing terror attacks from extremist groups, conflict, violence, insecurity, with the major threats to realizing the African Union's Agenda 2063. To address this, widespread instability in Africa, and with the aim of leaving the continent at peace to the next generation, African leaders committed to working towards a continent free from conflict by 2020. It's been 9 years since this declaration, which has become known as Silence the Guns in Africa by 2020, and 6 years since the master roadmap of practical steps towards implementing its objectives were adopted. Given this context, Africans' own insecurity is serving as a source of concern for not only the Africans, but in a global context. This growing concern is one of the contributing factors behind the phrase African solution to our problems, a phrase that has become the boast of the continent, as well as a way to show that Africa has both the capacity and the determination to solve her own problems within and without the external interference. It is from this spectrum that the Peace and Security Division of the Nkafu Policy Institute, which is a think tank of the Dennis and Leonard Frontier Foundation, has craved the indulgence of these great African minds who are endowed with knowledge, with wisdom, to share with you, our audience, their thoughts on the effectiveness of the African solution to African problems in silencing the guns in Africa. This is going to pave way for our future leaders, our young generations, who are leaders of tomorrow in Africa, to listen from them, take the baton of command, and see how they shape our continent for a better one, that they will leave Africa in peace and green as we met it. Our panelists, Your Highness, Professor Dr. Christopher, you are all welcome to this, our event. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll introduce to you our dear panelists. I will begin with Chief Charles Taku. He's a leading international law expert, counselor, and mentor before international courts, tribunals, international judiciary bodies, international organizations, and states. He has held the following leadership positions in international professional associations. He's been a former president of the International Criminal Court Bar Association from 2017 to 2019. In this capacity, he addressed the Assembly of State Parties of the ICC during the 20th anniversary of the Rome Statutes on December 6, 2018. He addressed solemn opening of the International Criminal Court on July 18, 2018. He is a member for life of the Governing Council of the African Bar Association, formerly Vice President of the International Criminal Court Bar Association, formerly Vice President of the Association of Defense Counsel at the UNICTR, and formerly member of Bar Council of the Cameroon Bar Association. He has professional legal experience, first state diplomatic and legal practice, secondly, international criminal courts and tribunals. He had a lot of cases, which I will not name all because if I continue naming, we will not be able to live here. The list continues. You're welcome, Your Highness. I will move to Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, who is currently Senior Associate at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, which is based in Washington, D.C. in the USA. He has organized and advised international election observation missions in Benin, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Liberia, Madagascar, Mali, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. He has also designed and supervised country-specific democracy support programs with civic organizations, political parties, and legislative bodies in Benin, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, Liberia, Mali, Madagascar, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Togo. In this course of his work, Dr. Fomunyoh interacts regularly with heads of state and government, cabinet ministers, elected officials, and political and civic leaders. He recently designed and helped launch the African Statesmen Initiative, ASI, a program aimed at facilitating political transitions in Africa, encouraging former democratic heads of state to stay engaged in humanitarian issues, conflict mediation, public health, and other key sectors of political, economic, and human development on the continent. Dr. Fomunyoh has traveled in Africa, Europe, and North America. He is perfectly bilingual in English and French and holds a PhD in political science from Boston University. He is also a founder of a non-profit organization interested in supporting democracy and humanitarian causes in Cameroon. He has equally published extensively. We'll just go straight into our questions for the day. The first set of questions, the first round of questions, the first question will go to Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. Can you give our audience some conceptual clarifications of the slogan, African solutions to African problems?
Well, good afternoon to the participants. Good afternoon, Francis, and thank you so much for your very kind words of introductions. It's really a pleasure to be able to join all of you this afternoon for those on the continent and this morning for those in North America to participate in this conversation about where the continent of Africa is and how it's grappling with issues of security and political development. I'm also very privileged, really honored to be sharing the panel with my sister, Annie Barbara from Zimbabwe, currently a professor in South Africa, as well as my brother and longtime friend, His Excellency, His Royal Highness Chief Charles Taku, with whom we've been discussing these African issues for the past 3 decades, ever since our years as young students in the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon. So I'm really delighted to be here and to get our conversation going. First of all, I should say that there's a history to how this slogan came about. You know, Africa learned a very bitter lesson out of the Rwanda genocide. the continent felt betrayed by the international community, which failed to act, as over 800,000 Tutsis were slaughtered or massacred in Rwanda. And there was a strong determination on the continent never to let that happen again, and a sense that the continent ought to organize itself better to respond to its own crisis rather than wait or depend on the international community, which could let it down at the moment when it most counted. And so from 1994, those conversations were taking place until we got into 2002, when you would all remember the Organization of African Unity was replaced by the African Union. And the African Union brought a lot of hope because it seemed to capture at the moment the aspirations of the African people to have a continental organization that would look out for the African people, as opposed to being a club that looked out solely for the heads of states that were members of the Conference of Heads of States. And so the creation of the African Union brought a lot of hope and enthusiasm. And there was a lot of talk about new initiatives that would prepare the continent better to embrace its future. You may also be aware of the fact that the African Union, in its constitutive act, dealt with the question of whether African countries could intervene in crises in other countries. And whereas the Organization of African Unity had a very strong provision with regards to non-interference, the constitutive act of the African Union actually opened the possibility that African countries could go in and intervene in crises in other countries based on a number of conditions, three of which are if war crimes were being committed, if genocide was being committed, or if gross human rights violations were being conducted. But this opened the door, and it created an environment where Africans then felt that there was a need for collective security for us as Africans to be each other's keepers. The African peace and security architecture was then put in place with 5 strong pillars, notably the Peace and Security Committee of the African Union. Secondly, the Peace Fund. Thirdly, a continent-wide early warning system. Fourthly, the Council of the Wise. And fifthly, the African Standby Force. And so this was a wonderful moment. And I remember the heads of states of the continent coming out of the meeting in Abuja, Nigeria, and embracing this slogan, African Solutions for African Problems. And while this enthusiasm was real and genuine and could be explained and could be seen as a force for motivation, a source of motivation, some of us also warned that it should not become the pretext for us to isolate the continent from the rest of the world. And it should not become a pretext for African leaders to stand by with indifference when bad things were happening on the continent. And I remember at the time in 2005, 17 years ago, writing an op-ed piece that was published in the allafrica.com newsline that said we had to be mindful to make sure that this slogan does not become the pretext for us not to do right by our people. And I think that today, the jury is out to look at the balance sheet of the African Union and African countries to see if we've done good by the aspirations and the hopes of the people, the millions of Africans who saw this slogan as a rallying cry to do more for ourselves, or whether it has become the shield behind which African leaders hide themselves to do nothing about the multiple crises that now plague our continent. And I think this provides the framework for our discussion, and I'll be delighted to hear from our other panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for giving us, the background of this slogan, because most of us do not just know what it all meant. And with that we've got a lot of information from it. And I'll go to His Highness. Don't you think and may lead to further marginalization and isolation of the continent?
Thank you very much again for inviting me here. And thank my very good friend, Dr. Chris Fomunyoh, for giving all this background. This conference at least validates a key issue which one of our distinguished writers, which I will quote, raised in her book Unravel. That is Dr. Emma Uso that had get a copy. And she said, let me quote, "The ability to retrace history is a privilege unburdened to many. The ability to walk, speak, assemble, and hope is taken for granted. And tracing that ability is a well-worn tool of oppressors." The African Union, as my distinguished friend, Dr. Fomunyoh said, brought this slogan. I call it slogan for reasons that I will explain about solving African problems, providing African solutions to African problems. First, on the look at things, looking at the world multilateral treaty architecture, it was completely unrealistic in that sense, because the African countries themselves have signed a series of multilateral treaties, the Geneva Conventions, for example. They were parties to it. Secondly, the evolution of the world, where the frontiers of sovereignty have diminished, with the capacity of non-state actors, international cooperation and others to interfere, to walk free into different countries, the proliferation of arms. 3, the ghost of colonialism. That makes most of the African leaders, the very people who talk African problems are very problems, who have the offspring of colonialism, or they are beholden to the ghost of colonialism. At the time they were doing this slogan, the African countries themselves from the AOU themselves had their own multilateral treaty regime in place. Every of the issues they raised, as you will see on the African Union Master Roadmap of practical steps to silence the guns, each of those problems had different treaties on the continent. There's a treaty against the proliferation of small weapons. You have the treaty, the Lomé Treaty against the unconstitutional exchange of government. You have the treaty, the Mechanism for Conflict Prevention, Management and Resolution, 1993. Cairo Agenda for African Action, 1995. The African Common Position on Africa's External Debt. The IGS Decision on Constitutional Changes of Government, 1999. Lomé Declaration on the Framework for OAU, Response to Unconstitutional Changes of Government. You have all this. And of course, we have the architecture, the legal architecture for the African Court, the African Commission for Human Rights, and lately we have the Malabo Protocol. But the problem is, these very African leaders who were priding themselves on providing African solutions have not even committed themselves, shown the political will to sign onto these conventions and make them operational. If we had that treaty architecture, multilateral treaty architecture on Africa, and they were made operational, they were signed, they've signed onto this treaty and made them operational, the situation of Africa will change, we will not be where we are. Therefore, my worry, and the result we see today, is that the very people who are the problem, the bane of the problem of Africa, are the ones who were saying that they wanted to provide solutions. Now, look at the case of the coup d'etat, for example. Why are they having a coup d'etat? Because those are the structures, the military, the security architecture, which is meant to protect the people, that they co-opted, usurped their role, and used them to keep them in power. And that's why the population, the ordinary people, cheer these people on, even though what they are doing as a matter of law is wrong. We have the situation where the African leaders have not militarized the role of law, using court martials to try their civilians. And you have the situation where the war economy, the conflicts in Africa, the armed conflict are driven by the war economy because it enriches the number of people. And therefore, the question is, do these people who committed themselves to solve African problems, are they really committed to solving the problem, or they are the problems? That is the question that I hope each of us will think about and provide and propose an answer.
Thank you very much, Your Highness, for that brilliant explanation, where everybody is doubting whether the slogan is meaningful to itself. From what you just said, I wish to ask Professor, considering the fact that most conflicts across the continent of Africa has its roots in governance issues, do you think that democracy as practiced by the West could be a solution, or that a government that is capable to make and enforce laws and to provide goods and services to its citizens is enough, is the answer?
Thank you, Francis. And greetings to everybody. Good to be here at the Nkafu platform again. Now, I think the answer you are seeking for answers to is the question, simply put, is copy and paste democracy working in Africa? And my answer is a straightforward no, because casting ballots alone does not make a democracy. We have seen the problems we have had from Cape to Cairo, Senegal to Dakar to Dar es Salaam regarding bad governance, coups, threats, and constitutional power changes. All these issues revolve around the emphasis that has been laid on democratization through elections only. I think it has been put forward as the hallmark of democracy. And so whenever there is a successful election somewhere with minimal violence, then it becomes a democratic transition in that country, a successful one. But is it really all that matters? Now, taking a look at African leadership, we find that most of our leaders have subverted the process of reforms and all kinds of reforms to maintain their own hold on power and to deepen their roots. So the feasibility of having African democracy and setting about, proving their own predictions becomes very difficult because they end up inciting inter-ethnic violence, silencing the press, robbing their countries, looting, a better word, and of course, marginalizing the majority of the citizens. Therefore, we wonder, why is Africa's democratic march, why has it failed to be linear or monolithic? Because it is laden with reversals. Wherever you make a small democratic gain in one element, one aspect only, especially elections, we are bound to see 1 million reversals almost immediately after such a transitionary phase. So how then do we as Africans defend that kind of democracy when the West also reneges on its own promises, to uphold democracy in Africa, and of course, modeled along its own systems? If you take a look at what happened in the DRC when Kabila was still there, the West promised to give him aid, funding, and yet he was quite notorious for suppressing opposition groups and undermined the UN investigation of human rights atrocities, but he still got funding from the West. In Central Africa, war, genocide, political and economic disarray, refugees, they've all destroyed social cohesion, weakened the rule of law, and have led to massive human rights abuses. But still, we sort of design all our solutions to ameliorate these problems around elections and having some kind of a formatted way of governance that evolves around the issue of inclusivity as defined by the electoral processes. And that doesn't work. Remember, African leaders from way back to the first one that got independent, they all signed defense pacts with their former colonial leaders that they would come to their aid in the event of an attack. And these are still valid in many countries. And if they are not explicit, they still get the military support and the training and the arms, etc. Legally, of course, the system, the world order has been designed for that to be delivered legally. And yet these leaders are bad news in every sense of the word. Africa has tried to demonstrate its own kind of agency, which I'll speak to later again. And we have embraced the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which of course, almost the majority have signed up to. But remember, there's a big difference between signing, ratification, and implementation, and above all, domestication this and aligning it with the statutory provisions at the national level. That will remain the big challenge. We may have a solution there at the top continental level, but does this solution resonate with what is going on at the national level? Is there a willingness by the political leaders to distill all these protocols, all these standards, all these norms, and make them work at the national level, taking into account the local context or indigenizing their context so that it works? The problem for me is that there's been a lot of emphasis on procedural democracies or the procedural element of democracies at the expense of the substantive, part of democracy. That is the content of what democracy is itself, what it means to Africans, what is it that we want as Africans. Look at the Afrobarometer. This is an assignment for everybody. And look at how Africans define democracy in their countries and go back in time so that you get a good picture. And you'll find that especially in the beginning, people would define this in terms of having enough food, shelter, all the basic needs that others take for granted in the West. We don't even have that in African countries. Even here in South Africa, where there's a lot more money than everywhere else, we still, citizens pay for water, buy water. The poorest of the poor buy water in the rural areas. And so you find that we are miles apart from what they already have in place for them to have these democratic tenets work. For us, it goes back to something else, the very basics. Where do we start from? How do we survive? Where is my next meal going to come from? Where is my next support? How will I pay school fees as prescribed by the economic structural adjustment programs? How do I even get my child to go to school and escape this poverty trap? So unless and until we get to define democracy that addresses our substantive issues as well and our needs, it will remain difficult and there will continue to be reversals. We'll have an election here, a coup the next day, 10, 15 years, something good, stable, and then things start all over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that brilliant explanation. We'll move now to the second round of questions, and each question, dear panelists, is 3 minutes so that we can catch up with time. Doctor, considering the fact that some problems in Africa are not only African problems because the United Nations, for example, reserves the right to intervene in peace and security, don't you think it's better we say appropriate solutions to African problems? Or another way we'll say African-driven solutions to African problems than African solutions to African problems.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Francis. And I agree with what's been said by my two co-panelists, and they put them very beautifully. His Royal Highness said, if I can paraphrase, we've put foxes in the hen houses. The people who are supposed to be providing the solutions are the ones causing the problems, and we have to do something about it. and Professor Annie Barbara said, we have to give content to democracy. It's not just, we have the instruments beautifully written in the African Union, in the peace and security architecture. We have the standby forces that were promised for 2010. We're now in 2022. Nobody's seen the standby brigades in operations anywhere. We have these beautiful things. We have the African Charter, which reads beautifully, but if it's not being implemented, then we can have the results that our people are hoping for. Let's also remember that Article 1 of the United Nations Charter stipulates that the United Nations has the responsibility for peace and security around the world. And now, of course, in Article 23, the United Nations confers that responsibility to the United Nations Security Council. And so when the African Union or even our sub-regional entities take measures to enforce peace and security or to bring about peace and security, in some ways, they're doing it on the basis of an assumed delegation of power or power of attorney from the UN Security Council. And I worry that we are trying to take on ourselves issues that should be dealt with globally when we have neither the political will nor the capacity to be able to do so. For example, the world today is facing what is being called the global war against terror. Initially, we all remember that the terrorist attacks targeted specific countries. And so if these countries were in the same mindset as our leaders were, they would have said, this is an American problem, for example, or this is a European problem because the terrorists are attacking us. They made it, they transformed it into a global issue. And now the world is faced or engaged in that global fight against terrorism. Why is it that when it comes to Africa, we define our problems in a way that cuts out the responsibility of the rest of the world, when at the same time we cannot deliver the services that our people expect? And so your question also speaks to my worldview of where Africa is. I feel that Africa deserves to take its seat on the global stage. We have the wherewithal, we have the human capital, we have the talent to be able to stand our ground, occupy a seat, and speak on the global stage. But we will not do that if we're playing on the defensive. And so because we're in a football season and everybody on the continent is seized by what's going on now with the African Cup, I can say that I can use this analogy that if we take the ball into our 18-meter zone and we say, this is Africa, and so this is an African issue, and we even speak about the continent as if we are one country. We hate it when people outside of Africa talk about Africa as if we're one country. The way that Ghana approaches its politics is very different from the way that Zimbabwe is approaching its politics. The progress that has been made in Botswana is far ahead of what is being done in the DRC. And so we have that diversity, but we tend to sometimes speak about ourselves as if we're one country. And so if we take the ball and we keep it in our 18-meter zone, and we say this is Africa, and we get territorial about our problems, as well as about the solutions that should be brought, we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to play on the global stage. The only way that the African voice is going to be heard and taken seriously is if we take the ball into the 18-meter zone of the world. That is how we're going to be able to get our goals. That's how we're going to get Africa's voice to be heard. That's how we're also going to get Africa to be taken seriously. Because there's even something pejorative about that slogan. There's something pejorative that says, oh, if it's Africa, then you can have minimal standards because it's an African problem. Let them come up with their African solution, which is minimalist. Whereas the global standards are perceived to be higher standards. And by doing this, we are inferring that the African people cannot aspire to those same international standards that apply to everyone else and that are being taken for granted in established democracies. So when elections, and Professor Annie Barbara touched on elections. So when elections go badly in an African country and maybe 50 people are killed, then people say, oh, well, just 50 people died. There were a few incidents here and there, but by African standards, that's okay. That's not okay. We should be saying we are global citizens. We want to play on the global stage. The standards that apply internationally should also apply to our people. Our problems should be diagnosed the way other international issues are diagnosed. And the problems, the solutions should be put together with the same sense of urgency that other international problems are, with which other international problems are addressed. And I think it is through this approach that we can really be taken seriously by the rest of the world and given the opportunity to also have our say in how other global issues are handled. Thank you.
When we talk about considering the evolution of the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon, is it a dream to think that the belligerent can sit together and find a real solution to end the conflict?
Well, that's a very good example of how our leaders have tended to approach conflict resolution on the continent with an inward-looking, insular approach that doesn't bring a speedy resolution to the conflict. And in the interim, people are dying, lives are being lost, not in the dozens, not in the hundreds, but in the thousands. And we have close to 1 million people or over 1 million people that are now internally displaced out of a population of about 6 million. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are now refugees in other countries. We have villages that have been burned in the hundreds. And people are sitting in offices and they're saying, this is an internal problem and we will resolve it amongst ourselves. People have already died. People have already taken up arms. Young people who were college students 5, 6 years ago are now adults. And some of them are now surviving because they're living in forests. Some of them are now surviving because they have guns in their hands. And if you look at the continent of Africa, no conflict in which citizens have taken up arms against the central government, no conflict has been resolved without the mediation of another African country and without efforts being undertaken outside of the country. So we remember the wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and His Royal Highness Chief Taku was involved in the Sierra Leone dispute, so he knows that well. Those wars ended up with the Abuja Accords, the Accra Accords that helped bring peace to those countries. We remember about the civil war in Cote d'Ivoire. That civil war was resolved through the Ouagadougou Accords that got the Ivorians traveling to Upper Volta or Burkina Faso to find a mediated a resolution to the conflict. Look at what happened in the DRC Congo. The war in Congo was resolved first through the Lusaka Accords in Zambia, and when that couldn't work, They ended up in South Africa with the Sun City negotiations that led to peace in the DR in Eastern Congo. Look at what happened in Sudan. The war in Sudan was resolved through negotiations mediated by Kenya, and that ended up in the comprehensive peace agreement signed in Nairobi. And so you go one conflict after the other on the African continent, and you see that in external mediation, that's mediation outside of the country in conflict, had to be brought in to be able to convene the parties at war and create a neutral space for these parties to be able to air their grievances and for those grievances to be negotiated, discussed, dealt with, and for peace to reign. And so I'm dumbfounded that 5 years into this war, we're still talking as if we're in 2016. There is an urgent need for us to resort to a third-party mediated process that can bring peace to this country. And my sense is that there are a number of African countries that are willing to play that role if there was a sense that their good offices would be most welcome. If not, we insulate ourselves. We keep talking about it as if it's an internal problem. People are dying. We keep talking about it as if it's an African problem. People are dying, and the wounds are getting deeper and will be extremely difficult to heal. So that would be my recommendation. And if I could just, in 1 minute, also take another example of how we deal with issues that should be global concerns, and we shoot ourselves in the foot. We deprive ourselves of the opportunity to tackle them because of the way in which we diagnose them, because of the way in which we define them. Look at what has just happened in the extreme northern part of Cameroon. We had intercommunal conflicts between the Sogom and the Arab Shua populations in the extreme northern region of the country. And this is being defined as an internal problem. But we now have 100,000 refugees in a country like Chad. Now, a smart leader would define this issue to link it to the global debate that is currently going on climate change and global warming, COP21. That's what the world is seized with right now. And what is happening in the extreme north is that the Lake Chad Basin has lost 1/3 of its water in the past decade. And that has led to communities that depended on the Lake Chad for water resources and for their well-being to now be scrambling over resources and notably access to water. If you define that issue as a global problem, you're likely to receive more global support in the solutions that you can bring that would improve the well-being of your people. And I think these two examples should remind everybody that we don't need to shoot ourselves in the foot and we need to move urgently. There's a sense of urgency in finding solutions to those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fomunyoh, for those remarks. And this just brings me Chief Charles Taku. Let's talk about the growing conflict in the region as in the continent as a whole, and the failure. Can we interpret these growing conflicts as the failure of the African Union or other regional economic communities in addressing African solutions to African problems? How do you think we can interpret this?
Well, let me say something very quickly, then I'll answer the question very briefly. When a leader declares a war, that declaration immediately triggers the application of international law. First, as a matter of international customary law and as a matter of international conventional law. The declaration by the President of Cameroon of war against the Southern Cameroon triggered the application of international law, the Geneva Convention and others. Secondly, as the ICC determined a few months ago in the Rohingya case, if Cameroon signed the Rome Treaty, but had not become a state party to the ICC. The Rome Treaty will apply if international crime under the Rome Treaty are committed because the signature of Cameroon jumpstarts customary international law that bound by international law by virtue of the fact they signed that treaty, saying that the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, are now the crime of aggression. If we commit them, we are held accountable. So they can no longer say because we are not members. Things have changed. Secondly, the question of African Union and other bodies. This is just a smoke screen because the only internal process that they have is the military solution, hoping that they should give them more time to kill and exterminate as many people as possible and use the force of power in order to exterminate and kill more, and on the conscience of the free world. That cannot be the same because, as my learned friend said, both the United Nations Charter, both international customary law, both the law and customs of war, makes it mandatory that impunity will never go unpunished. And everyone should know this. It will never go unpunished. The next issue is the African Union. The African Union is held hostage by its inability to raise the resources to solve its own problems. They took a bold initiative by the African peacekeeping forces that they sent to Somalia, Central African Republic, and others. But when this is being paid for by the European Union, they cannot raise their own resources. They will not even pay their own dues. They treat the whole African Union itself with impunity, with a lot of disrespect. The African countries. The multilateral treaty in the continent has not been signed. Africans can no longer go to the African Court of Human Rights and bring about cases of violation to their human rights. So in this particular setting, what is the African Union? What is it worth? Secondly, it has refused to reform, to conduct an necessary reform, to take into consideration the changes in the world. We just talk about climate change. We talk about the question of refugees, where millions of Africans are dying in the Mediterranean and in the desert, on the face of Africa looking at them. It doesn't matter. Their own citizens are dying. Of course, we talk about the slaughter, sending soldiers to raise whole villages, the subsistence economy of the population. It doesn't matter to them. All what it matters is once in a while to call a conference, pass worthless resolutions. I'm afraid one of the problems you see with the conflict in Africa, as the learned professor said, about the level of poverty, about the fact that Africans themselves cannot no longer even control the investment contracts. The fact that war has become what we call the war economy. We saw it in conflict. The fact that these other countries, you say it's an internal conflict, then you are receiving arms from other countries, colonial masters, to kill the people. But the time has come when the African masses, the other people are going to say enough is enough. And that time of the revolution is now. And there are uprisings in different countries. The military are upstaging the population. By saying they too have been used and are being used as tool of oppression by these leaders whom they've rebelled against, the African masses, and as Europe closes the frontier of immigration, and African countries want to close the frontiers and rise and kill African refugees, the time of Africans themselves turning around and killing each other and debasing the humanity in Africa is now. So what must we do? This is one effort that we can talk, because we have been talking in other fora about this. But we have to sound the warning. You heard Dr. Fomunyoh saying, when they brought the slogan, African conflict, he wrote, warning. It has happened more than 20 years after. I want to give that warning. First, transitional justice. You cannot kill And so let's say either you're a president or you're anybody whatsoever, the international treaty regime will get you and get every other person. And nobody should use a national flag to cover up atrocity crimes committed under the ground that I'm a minister or anything. I can tell you, when the time comes, people must know that the dead have a voice from their lonely graves. That time is coming soon. And therefore, as strongly hold, African Union must reform and reform radically. And African Union must also reform to take into consideration that Africans in the continent, no matter where they are, must be protected, protected by African multilateral treaty regime. The level of hatred on the continent by people whom I say it is a ghost of colonialism. But must we continue to blame colonialism and colonialism for everything? No. Honorable Adegoke Adelabu said that could it be that Africans fought so much and died for independence without knowing what to do with it? Is that not what answer can we give? What answer can African leaders give to that question that was asked by Honorable Adegoke Adelabu many years ago? Today, Africa is the laughing stock of the world. But we will not let that happen. Wherever we are, we'll continue to fight because Africans now can identify that the enemy are people who take the responsibility to protect them, but they are the ones actually massacring. They are responsible for the brutality and the debasement of humanity in Africa. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Your Royal Highness. I'm back again after the hitches, alternate hitches. Time is against us, but we will struggle to see how we go through to the end. Professor, I have two questions for you. I'll just ask the two questions at once, and then maybe you'll be able to know how to handle them to our audience. Considering the fact that terrorism has become the world's problem and particularly have an impact in Africa, do you think that terrorism can be fought by Africans following this slogan, African solutions to African problems? The second question is, how should Africans organize themselves to really address African solutions to African problems?
Thank you. I'll also try to be just as quick and brief. Let me start by first giving an illustration of how Rwanda, when it was torn by the genocide in 1994, it found a solution for the post-1994 genocide period because the system there took charge and there were no refugee camps, no UNHCR camps, because we know what happens when you have those camps. They come in and they last 40, 50 years. They're trying to match each child with a relative in studies to locate who is most suitable, etc. Rwanda would still be a mess today if there hadn't been a solution by Rwandans to their problem. We may contest the nature of the solution, but all the same, it stopped the mass killings and stabilized the country so much that they were able to make the progress that they are currently demonstrating to the world now. So African solutions are possible and have been demonstrated in this case. And there are some pockets of cases all over the region that we can collect. But to answer my question, we need to understand, first of all, what is the nature of terrorism in Africa? Well, it is defined as the #1 global problem. But when we come to Africa, what is the nature of terrorism? Dr. Fomunyoh just explained that terrorism, of course, has been defined as the #1 issue in the world, and it's the scourge that everybody has to join the bandwagon and fight against. But then we need to understand what the nature of terrorism is in Africa. A colleague just explained earlier on about how Africa gets expected to do this and that in the fight against terrorism, and how we sometimes end up being marginalized. And even though we are not at the forefront of the attacks and the problems, we get caught in the trap somehow. Now, who in Africa becomes a terrorist? Who gets to be called a terrorist? What grievances drive Africa's terrorism? Just taking a sweeping look across all the countries, you find that it's mostly rural areas, remote areas where you lack security, that are attacked. And sometimes some of the remote strategic posts, such as like the coastlines, etc., we are not very good with enforcing security on our coastal zones in the region. But a lot of the attacks, looking at what has happened in West Africa, including in Mozambique and in Tanzania to some extent, it's very remote areas, very distant, peripheral areas that are sometimes almost forgotten, where citizens are massacred in these terror attacks. And the issue of space matters because it also defines who gets caught in this trap, what kind of person becomes a terrorist then, who gets to be absorbed into these structures in those remote areas. It is not our usual city boys, living relatively better lives than those in the rural areas, where if you are not into agricultural production, there's nothing for you there, or if you are not into fishing. We have unemployed youth filling the ranks of the terrorists, those that get recruited and absorbed into these different ideologies by different groups with different missions, and with grievances that sometimes don't even resonate with the locals, but they are sort of global reasons as well for participating. You have youth who have zero prospects, for a bright future, but then they are lured by the attractions of modern technologies in the world, and some end up becoming terrorists for that reason. Very little, reasoning, that gets them to participate in these killings. However, they all are defined by one thing: minimal education opportunities and marginalization from all aspects of development, or all aspects developmental across sectors. Yet Africa has set very impressive frameworks for fighting terrorism within the APSA, the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, and of course the standby brigades that are never really standing by. We saw that when Mozambique had a crisis and it took almost 8-9 months to mobilize the SADC forces, that brigade just simply wasn't there, the standby brigade. And yet I'm sure resources are committed to maintain this brigade and run it and do trainings, etc. But the opportunity sort of came up and they did not rise to the occasion. And then we found out that in Mozambique, they ended up, of course, for other political reasons, inviting Rwanda, a preferred African country, over SADC friends who were accused of having different interests in the country. But the point I want to explain here is that we have these frameworks, even the African governance architecture, which aims at building inclusivity and involving everybody onto the bandwagon in peace building, democracy governance, etc. But we find that when there is a need to use these structures, there are always more dominant intervening external hands that drive the responses. And these end up alienating Africans in the process. Mali, we have seen that time and again, and look what has happened now, and the crisis, and sucking in other countries in the region, as well as what has happened to Burkina Faso. And again, in Mozambique, it's the same thing. The EU were the really preferred partner there that was assumed to be neutral and could offer better services. Of course, they would come with weapons and a lot of other things, unlike the SADC counterparts, or unlike Rwanda, which would likely go back with their guns. And yet, when you look at these countries, in Mali, in Mozambique, it's not just guns, the real guns, physical guns that are going on there. All these issues we've spoken about, they are all guns, the unemployment, these bleak, future prospects, the joblessness, just the marginalization from every aspect of life. You even end up marginalizing yourself. You stay away from spaces that you know you do not fit in because of who you are educationally and from where you come from, even if you are in your own country. And so as long as Africans cannot construct the peace processes, they will never own it, and grievances will continue to fester, because we also have a problem in that as the African Union, as African countries, we have way too many laws. There are too many protocols, standards, norms, etc. And having too many laws is as good as not having anything in place at all. Because when you try to harmonize them so that you can get some action, it becomes next to impossible, because you have a little bit of this and that everywhere, scattered all over the different frameworks that we have. However, it's not hopeless, because we can find our own solutions. And just by looking at one category, the youth that gets sucked into these terrorism issues a lot more than anybody else, these youth in Africa continue to demonstrate amazing agency across all sectors. They are not heard, that's the problem. If we educate the youth and give them meaningful chances at prosperous futures, there will be some prosperity to look forward to. We have these African youth policies and frameworks by the AU, and at the national level, every government has an African national policy, a youth national policy, or a youth national department, empowering. But to what end? They don't gain traction because there are no resources that ever are allocated to all these frameworks, to all these standards and protocols, etc. So it is up to each government to do what it can when it wants to. As long as there are no resources allocated, we are not going to make any progress in silencing any guns or in fighting terrorism. It will always be there as long as there will be grievances. Therefore, give the youth and the marginalized people a lifeline that allows them to demonstrate their entrepreneurial creativity. Just like the Africa Free Continental Trade Area has done a marvelous framework and everything. But when you look at the practicalities of operationalizing it and how it works in and joins in with already existing frameworks like COMESA, like Taku, the South African Customs Union, like the SADC protocols, it's a nightmare. And each country will prioritize those long existing frameworks, all those tariff agreements, regimes, and the AFTA remains suspended there and is left to really big business. Therefore, the small fish, the youth, the people, the African citizens that really need this don't get to enjoy this. And lastly, we also are moving very slowly in adopting the fourth industrial revolution and all that it has to offer to future generations and even to current one, because that is the age that we are in. Remember, we were catapulted into this era by the COVID pandemic that has forced us to do a lot of things the way we are doing this now. And so if our citizens, if our youth in particular become more competitive because they have acquired knowledge around these technologies, it means that there will be enough competition in terms of domestic production and participation in global trade. We get a chance to insert ourselves into the global regimes. And so we can really talk about a meaningful revolution, that will, of course, expect a lot of massive investments in human capacity development, in skills development, and in ICT infrastructure. And so the question remains, is this even doable when no resources are allocated to any of even the development plans that are made at the national level? We have fantastic, amazing national development plans, but not a single one has a line item and resources that are allocated to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that explanation. I've learned a lot from it. Before I go to the last set of questions, Your Highness, let me take you a little bit, maybe you could give us 1 minute to maybe enlighten on this. Is this merely not a way, I mean, the African solutions to African problems that the slogan we've all been hearing, I got up as a young man, I'm hearing about it. Some people believe that it's just a mere way for African leaders to close African doors to international community in order to ensure that African leaders do not have to account for their contributions to the challenges on the continent. I mean, they do whatever they want, and they don't want the international organizations to come to maybe question them. Why did you do this? So they want to keep it to themselves. Even when they were talking about non-interference in the days in the past, that no country should interfere in another person's internal problems. So that's where we feel a little bit worried why they had to think about that.
Well, to be very, very quick, it is unrealistic, as we say. The world has changed. Let me say one thing. If you have the question of food security in Africa, the question of poverty and others, or the question of international trade, when you go to what they call the Doha rounds to negotiate, whom do you find there? African food products, agricultural products, with the Americans and other countries. So what I was just saying that the frontiers of international law and national sovereignty have changed exponentially. Technology has changed the world. The ability to make war among the people who are looking for, some of the people who come to the court here, there are people who never stepped foot in the country where the conflict took place, or even the African continent, but they can supply the weapons. So we are saying that the international treaty regime, which we either negotiate or sign, makes it difficult. Two, on looking from the perspective of the implementation of African solution to African problems, what do you find? There's only been a mechanism to allow the dictators to massacre their own people, to commit a genocide, to impoverish their own people, because African solution to African problem has not stopped them from handing over the investment contracts back to the multinationals in the colonial countries, has not stopped the colonial masters from using them by remote control in order to exploit the resources, and on occasion, kill their own people in order to exploit the resources for that. So, on implementation of the African solution, what have you found? You found more bloodletting in the continent. You found a lot of poverty. You found no rule of law. You found aborted democratic processes. You found the militarization of justice. You found, more and more oppression. And you found people in the public declaring war against other Africans using external resources. And of course, on the definition of terrorism, as the professor said, if you come around the world to say it's terrorism, we punish act of terrorism. But is terrorism, is it a cognizable crime? Has it been defined? People in Asia will say, look, no, these are definitions. People in Russia will say no. Americans will say no. At the end of the day, have Africans themselves be able to define terrorism? No. It's enough for one minister, erratic minister, to get up and call people who are defending themselves, call them terrorists. And go free. Kill them and say, kill terrorists. But if we put them on the stand and say, can you define what's terrorism? He doesn't have a definition. Maybe his own conduct will be more conduct of a terrorist than that of the people he's killing. So Africans, these slogans do not go as far as defining the problem and the solutions. So this is the complexity of the problem. So why not just implement the regime, the treaty regime, or architecture we should have in place first to give people access to the rule of law? For people, the ordinary man, to be able to take a government to court and have his case heard. Because justice is intended to protect that common man, not to protect the oppressor. So at the end of the day, I think this would be the answer. But it's very complex, because I'm saying this because I am in all the conflicts. Sierra Leone, Rwanda, ICTR from 1999. I'm now in Darfur, now in northern Uganda, Central African Republic, Kenya. I'm been in this conflict. I'm not only talking as a matter of norms, legal norms, because I know the people who are there. both the fighters on the other end, both the government, both the victims. And I see them every day and I talk to them. There's a lot of bloodletting in this continent on the watch of the African Union, in the face of the slogans that only buy time. And who are the people committing the crime? If these African leaders are not the ones who are primarily responsible because they off the tick and they're doing nothing, they are facilitators. Because I ask, the ICC, one of the reasons what criticism I made, you are looking for people who go to Africa, you target Africa. But where are the mineral for arms merchants? Where are they? Where are the weapons? Where do the weapons come from? In order to exterminate these people, who are the beneficiaries? That's what I was calling the war economy. And then you and me and others who are out denouncing this, for them, we are the enemy. No, it ought not to be so. And that's why the professor, you are doing a great job to teach our youth. And we are giving conferences everywhere. And everywhere we go, we do just what Dr. Fomunyoh did 20 years ago, by warning that this slogan may turn against us. And that is what we're listening today.
Thank you very much, Your Highness, for that response. We will now, since because we are out of time, we'll be going to the last part of our discussion this afternoon or this morning, wherever we find ourselves. Doctor, what message do you have for the young and emerging African leaders who are craving to take the destinies of the continent into their hands?
Thank you, Francis. And I would say, to be brave, one that we are now hearing from ordinary Africans. I would say, and it's been captured in this conversation, I get the sense that we have two Africas. It's the Africa of the African people who have great aspirations, great hope, great vitality, so much talent, and who want to do so much for themselves and for the continent. And then there is the Africa of the political elites, a clique that's manipulating the resources or misusing the resources of the continent, both in terms of human and material resources, for their sole benefits and the benefits of those that are pulling the strings from the back. And what we're seeing today is that that first Africa is saying very loudly, we have had enough and we're not taking it anymore. My word of advice to African leaders who are in the second category is to say, watch out for your legacy, because people will remember. It is striking that since independence, the leaders that are most revered in many African countries are the first generation leaders, because they made a mark, they had an imprint, they left footprints, and people saw that they meant well for their people. And many of them died poor because they invested in their countries. But since then, there's been almost a blackout. And some of the leaders who have been in power for 30 years, 35 years, 40 years, are only being talked about in terms of the havoc that they've created in their countries and the hardship and suffering that they've inflicted on their own people. I would say to African leaders, remember there used to be an African, the Organization of African Unity, but then it lost its value and people no longer respected it because people identified the OAU as no longer speaking to the needs and the aspirations of the ordinary African. If you don't make haste and quote unquote repent and change your governance styles, sooner or later, you're going to be thrown into the dusk of history, into oblivion, because you haven't served your people well. And finally, I would say that Africa has so much to offer the world. We, as citizens of the world, have such a huge contribution to make. We have to make our presence felt so the rest of the world can take us seriously. And if we don't do that, if we don't project on the global stage, everybody else is going to want to come to Africa to enrich themselves. Everyone else is going to want to come to Africa to extract our resources, and nobody is going to give us the agency that we have the potential to exert on the global stage. And so I'm hopeful that the energy that we're now seeing in the younger generation of Africans will materialize in reversing or restructuring the relationships that exist between Africa and the rest of the world. And if we don't get that right, we're going to continue to be on the receiving end of all of the injustices that we've talked about. And getting that right starts with putting our own houses in order. Because as you look through the continent, the multiplicity of conflicts and crises are almost self-inflicted by our own leaders in our own countries. Because we can manage our diversity. We can manage the public treasury, the public resources that we have in an equitable distribution of those resources. We have people who are supposed to be serving the public good as civil servants who end up being the richest in countries, not even the entrepreneurs, but the richest because they're feeding out of the public treasury. We have those kinds of injustices that provoke young people to feel that they have no choice but to take their lives into their hands and either brave it across the desert and the Mediterranean or take up arms to protect themselves. If we don't get that house in order, the rest of the world is not going to be taking us seriously, and we're not going to play to our full potential. Thank you very much for that very wonderful, pertinent question.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I will hurriedly go to Prof. Prof, if you were to rewind the hands of time and you are, let me say you are 18 today, what hopes do you have to bring Africa to the dreams and aspirations you've always thought of?
Thank you. That was a long time ago. I mean, but I think the first thing is I'm shocked by how dependence on donor financing has remained high throughout my entire life. I was very hopeful as a youth who started out in university and thinking that by this time, you know, things would have changed, things would have stabilized, but no, things have remained the same. And so I used to question myself back then, and I'm still doing, whether there is a realistic African agency for development, you know, at all. And if there exists some kind of agency, how African is it? How is it defined by African values and expectations? And what kind of development agency are these big institutions, the leading ones, the African Union, the continental level, are they pursuing? Because when you look at the economic and social stagnation of most African economies, in fact, all, it calls into question the effectiveness of that agency. And this has been building up the agency over a long time, since like the formation of the AU, going back to the AU. And when we look in relation to other regions, we find that the dominance of the top-down, predominantly state-led approach, which largely excludes and marginalizes most sectors of African society, from business, civil society, farmers, workers, peasants, women, youth, small businesses, you name it, everybody. It makes us ask the question, or it makes me ask the question, you know, is African agency inclusive of all Africans? Or is it an elite, technocratic, and middle-class agency? And if it is the latter, then can it really be an agency for development? These discourses that we have at this level, you know, they are questioning all that, because I used to question them in the beginning. And therefore—
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. We are almost out of time, and I wish to crave the indulgence of His Royal Highness that 1 minute he should maybe to end up by answering us this question. If you were to speak to the conference of the heads of states and governments of the African Union today, what measure or strategy would you recommend to help silence the guns in Africa by the year 2035? 1 minute, please. I'm sorry.
The first thing, put the African, the ordinary African, at the center of your preoccupation. 2, sign the treaty creating the African Court for Human and People's Rights. That is the other continent that gives the ordinary African everywhere the chance to take cases of violations in the continent. If not so, who will come in? Another country will come in. I just saw a question from May, somebody saying whether the conflict in the Northwest Highway was internal armed conflict or something. The question, nature of character of conflict was changed, was decided in the case of Tadic by the ICTY. And the ICC statute, Rome Statute, Article 7 and 8, they define. And 2, in this particular conflict, let me say one thing. The transborder crimes, deportation to Nigeria, kidnapping from bringing in, it links you directly to a state party. And look at the decision in the case of the Rohingya. But if I get to African leaders, I will tell them in one row, you have the blood of Africans in your hands. Get here and take a decision how you are going to atone for this blood and give back the African, the humanity that they've lost caused by you. That's what I would tell them.
Okay, thank you very much. We move now to the session of question and answers. We have 5 questions. I think His Highness has answered one of the questions. And there is one from Dan Widman, who says democratically elected leaders in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso were overthrown by coups. Street scenes of euphoria and celebration follow. Can you comment on this paradox? Thanks. I think Doctor will be able to answer this question.
Yes. I'm not surprised that every time the military intervenes in a political process, that the youth that we've been talking about, the people who have felt so marginalized and so disenchanted with the form of government would go into the streets to jubilate. But I would dare say that the military coups are not a solution to bad governance. The antidote to bad governance is good governance and democracy. And that the younger generation should remember, unfortunately, many of them were born in the 90s, early 2000s, so they didn't, like many of us, live to see, or they didn't have a firsthand real life experience with military regimes that Africa went through in the 70s and in the 80s. So Africa has gone down this path before, and the consequences were disastrous. And so while on the one hand, you condemn civilian elected leaders who perform poorly to the extent of serving as an incentive for people to look for other means to bring about political change, you also must recognize that military coups are not the way forward. We cannot as a people continue to dismantle our institutions every other decade. We cannot as a people imagine that by cutting our noses we'll make our faces prettier. We cannot as a people lose the opportunity to consolidate the gains that have been made and to look for ways to do better. We cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to find a way to bring about meaningful political change on the continent, and that change cannot come about through boots and bayonets. The military is not meant for that. The military is not meant to govern. We need better political leaders, and we have to continue to work hard to make sure that the best can be in a position to lead our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, our esteemed panelists, for this wonderful exchange of ideas and lessons we learned from you. And from what I have gathered as a summary, the greatest things that we Africans should do to solve the problems which are our own, that is bringing solutions to our problems, is to invest more on human security. because national security may not or has not been the best, but if you invest on human security, thinking about poverty, thinking about health, education, and every other thing, we will actually have a wonderful Africa in future. Many countries have done that and have succeeded. Costa Rica has done that and is succeeding, and is one of the happiest countries in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, our emerging leaders, the baton is in your hands, how to shape the continent so that we, those who might have failed, you will not fail. Let's look forward and see that Africa becomes peaceful, more peaceful and greener in the days ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Francis Tazaocha. Thank you very much to our panelists for a wonderful discussion. And of course, thank you to all those who joined us. We're sorry we could not take all the questions. We saw the wonderful comments. We appreciate that. We would like to encourage everyone to continue to follow the Taku Policy Institute and the Denis and Lenora Florida Foundation on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Taku Policy Institute and Denis and Lenora Florida Foundation. And indeed, you will be the first to know when we have any of such discussions. Also, I'll just like to use this opportunity to remind everyone that our works at the Taku Policy Institute are not only limited to issues on peace and security, governance and democracy, but also we are interested in the economic catalyzation of Africa. And that is why come February 25th, 2022, we are going to have a Grand Cameroon Free Trade Forum where we are going to discuss Cameroon's bilateral and multilateral trade. So please do join us. Links will be shared on our social media platforms. The event will be a hybrid one, so you can participate in this Cameroon Free Trade Forum online or on site. Also, as a reminder to those who are in Yaoundé, Cameroon, please do join us tomorrow at the Muna Foundation from 10 a.m. as we discuss women's educational rights. Thank you very much, and do have an excellent day and an excellent week.
Thank you.